Happy holidays, friends! It's become a bit of a tradition for me to talk about a Nancy Drew Christmas book around this time of year. But I'm not going to do that this year. Instead, I'm going to be festively dissecting A Crime for Christmas, which is a Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys SuperMystery. Technically, not a Nancy Drew book. The Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys SuperMysteries are all about Nancy and the Hardys teaming up to solve mysteries. But let's be honest, what they're really about is the unresolved sexual tension between Nancy and Frank. Super mystery, more like a super mutual pining, am I right? Anyway, enough fan fiction lingo. What is this book about? America's hottest teen sleuths team up when terror threatens a crown prince. I love the implication that Nancy and the Hardys are famous not for being the best teen sleuths, but for being the most physically attractive teen sleuths. I know I'm deliberately reading this a very specific way, and you could say that it's just saying they're the coolest and best and biggest in the business, but I don't care. This is my interpretation, and I'm sticking with it. Nancy Drew, all capitals, is in New York to join the Hardy Boys, all capitals, on an important case. They're conducting an intense manhunt for a pair of big-time cat burglars, and they're sure the daring criminal duo will try to scoop up a special prize, the spectacular crown jewels of Sarson, which are on display at a museum. Meanwhile, Nancy's friend Bess is enjoying the holiday season with a dream date, a handsome and mysterious guy called John. To impress Bess, John takes the gang on a torrid tour of Manhattan's fabulous nightlife. Their fling includes everything from horse-drawn carriages in Central Park to drawn guns at their Park Avenue hotel. But with political forces set to blow apart a gala UN dinner, Nancy, Frank, and Joe are suddenly trapped between hot rocks and a royal disaster. In A Crime for Christmas. I'm sure the political thriller plotline will get just as much weight and depth as the romance plotline. In the past, I've criticized the Christmas Nancy Drew books for not being Christmassy enough. That is not a problem with this book. The ghostwriter is literally falling over themselves to mention at least one festive thing per page, and I am eating it up like Christmas pudding. There's ice skating, Christmas trees, caroling, horse-drawn carriage rides through the snow, hot chocolate, and honest to God, one of the main antagonists is a vendor who sells hot chestnuts roasting over an open fire. It physically cannot get more Christmassy than this. As well as being super Christmassy, this book is also stuffed full of references to New York City, like a holiday turkey. Although I guess a holiday turkey would be stuffed full of breadcrumbs and things, not Saks Fifth Avenue. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if this book was secretly sponsored by New York City tourism. So of course the book starts off with Nancy and Bess in an iconic New York City taxi cab, stuck in an iconic New York City traffic jam. Don't worry though, this gives them lots of time to share exposition with the reader. The detectives are in the Big Apple on behalf of Sarson, a fictional European country, so it doesn't matter if I'm mispronouncing it or not. Sarson is either celebrating the country's 500th birthday or celebrating their joining the UN. I'm not quite sure which. Maybe both. And America's hottest teen sleuths have been hired to prevent the country's crown jewels from being stolen after their sources indicate that a pair of cat burglars intend to steal the jewels. Ahead of them in the traffic jam, Nancy and Bess spot a car with diplomatic license plates, which leads them to speculate. Bess's eyes were shining. I can't believe this. Crown Prince Jean-Claude may actually be riding in that car, only half a block in front of us. She whipped out a compact from inside her purse and looked into the mirror. Look at this, she wailed. My hair is a wreck. Yeah, I'm sure the Crown Prince is sitting in the back seat of the car with a pair of binoculars, peering intently into every other vehicle, looking for his potential future bride. So of course, Bess has to look her best. Nancy reminds her, don't forget, we're not here to meet and date Prince Jean-Claude. Oh, Nancy, You innocent little sugar plum, that is exactly why you're here, as dictated by the ghostwriter. Nancy and Bess then go on a shopping spree at Bloomingdale's. I can't believe you talked me into buying all this stuff, Nancy exclaimed, clutching a shiny red shopping bag that said, Christmas Mania at Bloomingdale's. I mean, I love shopping, but some of the stuff is just too much. Bess looked shocked. You mean the La Boue de Visage European epidermal regeneration treatment? Nancy, that stuff happens to be the rarest, most effective natural facial mask around. You can't get it back in River Heights. I know, Nancy said, but it still seems weird to pay so much for something that's really just mud dyed yellow. Look, I know this doesn't seem important, and I also didn't think it would be, but I swear to you, this is plot-relevant facial mud. So just keep that in mind. The girls then go into a chocolate shop. Nancy looked into the back room. There she saw a huge metal tray covered with rows of intricately molded chocolate crowns. Sorry, those aren't for sale. We're supposed to put them in a box. They're a special order. The salesperson looked quickly right and then left. Hang on a second, he said with a mischievous grin. He sneaked into the back room and brought out a small, square wooden box. Don't tell anybody, he whispered, winking at Bess. It's on me. Look, I know this doesn't seem important, but I swear to you, this is a plot-relevant chocolate crown. This is in fact revealed very quickly when someone snatches the bag containing the chocolate crown out of Bess's hand almost as soon as they leave the store. This is the end of chapter 1, and just to demonstrate to you how crammed full this book is with Christmas references, we've already had someone singing the Christmas song, Christmas shoppers, Christmas trees outside the Girls Park Avenue Hotel, Christmas trees inside the Girls Park Avenue Hotel, someone playing Silent Night on a piano, candy wrapped in Christmas colors, someone saying Merry Christmas, and a snowflake made of lights. It was 10 pages. Chapter 1 was 10 pages. I'm not complaining though, the more the merrier. Okay, question. How many men does it take to steal a chocolate crown? Apparently 3, because that's how many Nancy sees fleeing the scene of the crime. More than I would have thought. She catches up to 2 of them. Nancy charged the man on the left and grabbed the arm that was holding the shopping bag. She yanked it behind his back and kicked him sharply behind the knees. Ow, the man cried out, collapsing onto the ground. There was a moment of stunned silence before the man on the sidewalk peered up. For the first time, Nancy got a good look at his face. Nancy's jaw dropped. Joe Hardy, she exclaimed. She looked over and saw Frank Hardy watching them, doubled over with laughter. That was a mean trick. I thought you were the infamous New York City chocolate thieves, Frank said. Oh, hilarious. But apparently, Frank and Joe aren't just pulling a funny prank on Nancy and Bess. We didn't take your bag. We were crossing the street to meet you when we saw the whole thing happen. Joe nodded. The guy got away, but he knocked into someone and the bag fell onto the ground. The group decides to go to the Hard Rock Cafe for dinner. I hope this place is good, Frank said. I'm starving. Yeah, Nancy said. Me too. Inside, she cringed. Yeah, me too? Was that all she could say to him? For some reason, she was starting to feel nervous. Maybe there was something about Frank. Maybe it was his deep brown eyes, which sparkled whenever he spoke to her. Maybe it was his keen intelligence, which kept questioning her. Whatever it was, Nancy felt a strange confusion. Being with Frank made her feel excited and alive, but also she felt slightly guilty about her boyfriend, Ned Nickerson. Nancy laughed at herself. After all, it wasn't as if she were in love with Frank. It was so ridiculous to have guilt pangs. Sure, Nan. Over dinner, they talk about the case. They're specifically looking for a father-son duo of cat burglars, as per their source. And Joe is going to pretend to be a photographer to scope out suspects in the lobby of their hotel, the Winslow, which the cat burglars are apparently working out of. Back at the hotel, the group meet an attractive and suave man named John, who Bess instantly falls for. Nancy and Bess go up to their room, which is on the 4th floor, and hear a rattling at the window. On closer inspection, there's a man outside, and not just any man. It's John, the guy they just met. Ladies, is it a red flag if you exchange 5 words with a man and he then climbs up to your 4th-story window and asks you to let him in? Yes, it is. The only other person I know of who does those 2 things is Dracula, and I wouldn't exactly call that a good sign. Nancy and her friends also don't consider that climbing up buildings is a principal characteristic of a cat burglar. You know, the very thing they're at the hotel to find. That's what you get for hiring the hottest teen sleuths instead of the smartest teen sleuths, I guess. And what's John's reason for climbing up to their window, I hear you ask? After a couple days in the city, I feel trapped. I long for the outdoors. So you climb buildings, Nancy said dryly. Right, just a totally normal man. Most normal guy. John said, you see, I grew up in a place that is surrounded by great thick forests and towering mountains, so I developed a passion for climbing. If this were a park, I'd be climbing trees. If it were a quarry, I'd be climbing rocks. He shrugged. But it's the city, so I must settle for what I can find. I have to say, though, that this building's architect must have been an outdoorsman, too. The handholds on this building are wonderful. God, something smells in here. Oh, right, it's that fresh heap of bullshit. But perhaps Nancy is wearing a nose plug, because even though John's story was hard to believe, Nancy did believe it. Nancy, please. Explain your reasoning to me. If you find all this a bit hard to believe, you will struggle even more with what comes next. John's like, hey guys, wanna go hit up some clubs? And I'm thinking, no way am I going to the club with some random guy who just climbed in my bedroom window. Smash cut. Nancy, Bez, and the Hardy Boys are dancing with John at the club. And naturally the dance floor is red and green and fake snow is falling because heaven forbid you forget this is Crime for Christmas. I guess now is probably as good a time as any to tell you that this book tries to set up a love triangle between John, Joe, and Bess. That's right, Joe Hardy and Bess Marvin. It's very weird and seems to just be in the book to add an additional layer of drama. Joe notices John having a suspicious chat with a man in a dark corner. Finally, his mind begins to put the pieces of this metaphorical puzzle together. And this puzzle only has 2 pieces. Think about it. What kind of person just happens to climb the outside of a building in the night and has a clandestine meeting with an older man in the back of a club? Really, it was him having a conversation with a man that made you think he might be a cat burglar, not him literally climbing up a wall? America's hottest teen sleuths, everyone. Back at the hotel, Nancy and Bess notice their room was ransacked, but nothing appears to have been taken. We also find out that the bag containing the chocolate crown has been stashed in the Hardy Boys' room this whole time, which couldn't possibly be relevant, right? Meanwhile, Bess gets annoyed that the others would dare suspect the man she met 5 minutes ago who climbed into her room in the middle of the night of being a criminal. He's too nice to be a cat burglar, she says. I'm not sure if nice guys break into girls' rooms while they're sleeping, Bess. The next day, Joe is taking pictures of potential suspects in the lobby and meets an attractive young woman named Fiona Fox. Look, I know this doesn't seem important, but I swear to you this is a plot-relevant, attractive young woman. That night, you'll never guess what happens. Tip, tip, tip. Nancy's eyes flicked open. She looked over and saw Bess in her bed. Where was that noise coming from? Tip, tip, tip. The window. With cat-like stealth. Oh my god, maybe Nancy's the cat burglar. Nancy stepped out of bed and peered behind the drapes. I thought you'd never hear me, came a soft voice. Nancy took a deep breath, her heart thudding in her chest. You know, John, she said angrily, there's nothing wrong with using the hallway. Please, just let me in, John pleaded. Yeah, this man has the freaking audacity to break into their room again. He's like, oh, come on, guys. I want to go out. Let's go. But when they try to leave the hotel, a police officer immediately puts Nancy, Bess, and the Hardys under arrest for kidnapping Prince Jean-Claude of Sarkhan. That's right. Not only is John a weird man who climbs into girls' bedrooms in the middle of the night, he's also a rich European prince. Now that's a Sarkhan. What a catch. Am I right? Jean-Claude, as we'll call him from now on, prevents the gang from being arrested, and we meet his minder, Count Renaud. I'm so sorry, especially to Raphael and other French viewers. If you're watching this, my pronunciation is perhaps not so good. But you know what? We don't know if these are actually French names. They're Sarconian names, so they're probably pronounced a completely different way. Apparently Jean-Claude climbed out of his room as a way of evading his bodyguards, which makes his actions 5% more understandable. Later the next day, the group goes sightseeing. A street vendor was calling out, "Chestnuts, hot, here's your chestnuts." "Ooh," Bess said, "those smell good and warm." Jean-Claude stopped short. "Your every wish is my command," he said, reaching into his pocket. He walked away from the others to the vendor and said, "5 bags of your biggest, hottest chestnuts. Keep the change." He held out a $20 bill. "Sure, buddy," the vendor said. He pocketed the money. As Jean-Claude reached out for the first bag, the vendor grabbed his wrist and wrenched it sideways so that Jean-Claude stumbled and lost his balance. What's going on?" Jean-Claude said. With a strong yank, the vendor pulled Jean-Claude around to the back of the cart. Unable to turn around and face his attacker, Jean-Claude kicked behind him. "Yeah, kick him right in the chestnuts." The chestnut vendor and some accomplices push Jean-Claude into a van and drive away. Joe pushes Jean-Claude's limo driver out of his seat, roars off, and so begins an exciting limo chase through Central Park. Joe almost kills 6 people and 2 horses with his reckless driving, but it doesn't matter because he saves Jean-Claude. Jean-Claude wants to hire Nancy and the Hardy Boys to be his bodyguards, but Count Renaud is against it. Nancy eavesdrops while the two argue, obviously while standing behind a giant Christmas tree. "They're common, and need I spell out the motives of people like that? That fortune huntress, what's her name? Beth Melvin? Common. Clearly the Count doesn't know Nancy's dad's a lawyer." However, Jean-Claude sticks up for his new friends and insists on hiring them anyway, albeit in an unofficial, unpaid volunteer capacity, because of course a crown prince wouldn't have any spare change lying around to pay his employees. The next day, Fiona Fox asked Joe if he'd like to join her and her father for a hot chocolate, but he has to decline as duty calls. He's lost sight of Jean-Claude. He and Frank find the prince making out with Bess in a dark corner, and Count Renaud is not happy. "I believe I am owed an explanation, Jean-Claude. You've alienated not only me, but also your friend Frank and his girlfriend." "Girlfriend?" Nancy was taken aback for a moment, but she knew that now wasn't the time to correct Renaud. The Count calls Bess a lower-class gold digger and storms off. Jean-Claude then takes the sleuths to what sounds like a BDSM club. 3 girls in black leather outfits were singing backup vocals from a huge steel cage. Oh, so this is the torrid tour of Manhattan's fabulous nightlife. Not a place I expected Nancy Drew to end up. But ignore the people in gimp suits if you can. Nancy and Frank are having a moment. "Now that you're my girlfriend, I have to do things to impress you." Nancy looked at him blankly. It sounded as if he was joking, but why would he say something like... Frank caught her confused glance. "Renaud's comment. In the lobby," he said, reminding her. "Remember? He referred to you as my girlfriend." He laughed and shook his head. "Oh, right," Nancy said softly. Suddenly her throat felt as if it were coated with cotton. "Imagine that, you and me." She meant to laugh it off, but the remark came out sounding wistful. But Frank looked back at her with a warm smile. He didn't appear to be embarrassed. "Yeah, imagine," he said gently, his brown eyes shining. But before they can say anything else, Bess is grabbed by 3 men in ski masks. Damn these cock-blocking kidnappers. They grab Jean-Claude too, and Nancy and the Hardys give chase. They manage to fight the attackers off and go back to the hotel, where they enjoy some hot cider and Christmas cookies in front of a roaring fire. Jean-Claude seems more upset by this kidnap attempt than the previous one, but becomes a bit more himself after eating a few Christmas cookies. Soon some of the other people in the room began leaving. "We chased them all away," Bess said with a laugh. "I don't know about that," Jean-Claude said softly with a rakish smile. "Maybe they were blinded by the 2 fires in the room." "2?" Bess said curiously. "There's only 1 fireplace." "You have forgotten the fire of your incredible beauty." Bess giggled. "Oh, stop it." Nancy couldn't help cringing a little. "Don't you recognize a line when you hear it?" she wanted to ask Bess. "You shouldn't fall for him so easily. Where was this skeptical energy when you believed that Jean-Claude liked to just climb up walls for fun, Nancy?" Joe goes up to his room to get something and is knocked on the head and falls unconscious. Eventually the others get worried and go look for Joe and find him being tended to by Fiona Fox's father, Dr. Fox, who apparently just stumbled upon the scene of the crime moments after it happened. Thank goodness he was there. After Joe is recovered, the group, including Fiona Fox, go ice skating at the Rockefeller Center rink. Nancy gazed back and forth between the 2 couples, Bess and Jean-Claude, Joe and Fiona. Each of them seemed to glow with a special light no one else shared. The radiant smiles, the giddy laughter. It was as if each couple was in its own orbit, miles from the other people on the rink. A warm feeling spread through Nancy. If only Ned were here. She imagined herself gliding across the rink, looking up into those wonderful eyes. All of a sudden, Nancy realized it wasn't Ned's eyes she was imagining. It was... Immediately, she became conscious of Frank's presence beside her, and hard as she tried, she couldn't control the rush of blood to her face. She just knew she was turning beet red. "He's going to notice this," she thought. "He's going to ask me what's wrong. What am I going to tell him?" But if Frank did notice, he didn't let on. Instead, he kept staring at the rink, not saying a word. Finally, in a soft, almost shy voice, he said, "Looks like the 4 of them are having fun." Nancy nodded wordlessly. "Maybe we ought to..." Frank let his voice trail off. "Ought to what?" Nancy asked. Frank turned to look at her, only inches from him. Nancy could feel his brown eyes searching her face. "You know, I've been doing some thinking, Nancy." "Doing some thinking? I don't believe he's saying this," Nancy thought. Her heart was pounding wildly. Just then a roar went up from the crowd. Nancy and Frank glanced around. Silently, lazily, the first snowfall of the year had begun. Thick, meandering flakes landed on hats and shoulders as children reached up eagerly to catch them. Even the stodgiest-looking people on the rink were grinning and chatting with their partners. "Merry Christmas," Frank said to Nancy. "Merry Christmas," Nancy answered. "Damn the cock-blocking snow!" Then Nancy spots the kidnapping chestnut vendor. She tries to cross the ice to confront him, but inadvertently gets caught up in a game of snap the whip, and by the time she manages to extricate herself, he's gone. Back at the hotel, Fiona Fox asked Joe to show her his equipment. His photography equipment, that is. Joe flashed a cocky smile. "I figure that if you need photos developed in a hurry, you've got to do them yourself." Fiona laughed. "I suppose so, although I'd think one of those 24-hour photo labs would be perfectly adequate." Perfectly adequate. If Joe had heard anyone else's age use those words, he would immediately have thought total nerd. But somehow it sounded unbelievably sexy in that British accent and soft, deep voice. Oh, I should have done a British accent for Fiona. "I suppose so." That was not a British accent. "Although I'd think one of those 24-hour photo labs would be perfectly adequate." There you go. Not to mention those incredible flashing eyes. And that hair. He had a new mission now, to make Fiona think he was the most exciting man she had ever met. and to do it before Jean-Claude noticed her. Perfectly adequate, Joe scoffed. Not if you only photograph subjects of the utmost beauty and complexity the way I do. Not bad, Joe said to himself, surprised at his choice of words. Well, Fiona said with a throaty laugh. That was my throaty laugh. When she tossed her hair back, it fell into perfect, lustrous waves. I guess you'll have to show me one of those beautiful, complex subjects. Joe led her out into the bedroom. Is Joe about to show Fiona his own personal, beautiful, complex subject? Is this book about to stray where a PG rating can't follow? Well, no, he's just going to show Fiona the picture he took of her earlier. Joe reveals that this is his only copy of the photo, but he does have the negative, and he volunteers to show Fiona how this whole photography thing is done. First, he would develop the photo, impressing Fiona with his darkroom know-how. The last step was a 10-minute bath for the print in a pan of water. For that 10 minutes, they'd have nothing to do in the dark, quiet, intimate room with the soft red light. Foolproof. Unfortunately, not proof of this fool, as Joe soon hears noises in the hotel room and discovers that another intruder has broken in. He gives chase but is unable to catch them and returns to the room to find Fiona locked in the closet and the negative gone. Just what I need, he thought. I finally meet the girl of my dreams, and I have to drag her into this ridiculous case. Then it's time to dash through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh in Central Park. In the carriage, Nancy, Frank, and Joe discuss the mystery. Joe shrugged. I'm still stuck on who the cat burglars are. You said you gave Fiona the photo you took of her, Nancy said. Was that the only copy you had? Yes. A cloud seemed to pass across Joe's eyes, and he slumped back against the seat. And then she asked you to get the negative out and make another copy? No, Joe answered. I volunteered to do it myself. So the father-son team is actually a father-daughter team, Nancy said. Fiona and Dr. Fox must have staged the theft of the negatives. Locking Fiona in the closet was a smokescreen, a way for them to appear innocent. Plot twist. What if cat burglar was woman, was hot, sexy woman? They'll never see that coming. Then the carriage Bess and Jean-Claude are in gets stopped by a limo. 3 men with guns come out and shove Bess and Jean-Claude in the limo, which isn't really in the Christmas spirit if you ask me. Then Nancy notices that the guy who was driving Bess and Jean-Claude's carriage is the chestnut vendor. She tries to confront him, but he says, "You tell your prince friend I'm gonna collect," and throws an ice ball at her. Back at the hotel, they're snowballed by bad news. The Foxes have checked out, and Count Renaud is very unhappy that they've lost Jean-Claude once again. It's beginning to look like he was in the right for not wanting Nancy and the Hardys to be the prince's bodyguards. They're not really doing a very good job of it, like constantly losing track of him like he's a spare sock or something. Then Jean-Claude himself bursts into the room. He escaped the kidnappers but left Bess behind, the dirty coward. Even worse, as Jean-Claude left, she was apparently screaming his name and crying for help. Jean-Claude just earned his spot at the top of Santa's naughty list this year, and also my naughty list, which is even worse. I'll give him more than a lump of coal. Oh yeah, and he also has no idea where he and Bess were being kept, despite him escaping from there. This man sucks. Bess, as always, deserves better. To the Hardys, Nancy says, "Do you remember how Jean-Claude reacted after being kidnapped by the chestnut vendor? Hardly fazed at all," Frank said. Right, and the same man just happened to be the driver of the carriage that kidnapped Jean-Claude? Why didn't Jean-Claude notice him? And why did the same man tell me that he was going to collect from Jean-Claude? Could it be that he was also trying to collect from Jean-Claude when he showed up at the Rockefeller Center rink? Just a minute, Nancy, Frank said. Are you saying? You bet, Nancy said with fierce conviction. Jean-Claude planned the whole thing. He had himself kidnapped. Of all the weird kinks, I love that his plan hinged on someone wanting to buy hot chestnuts. Like, what would he have done if they'd all just walked by? Would he have been like, oh, wait, guys, stop a moment. I really need to get some hot chestnuts right now. Like, if I don't get hot chestnuts, I don't know what I'll do. But I guess he's a prince, so he's, like, used to getting his own way and things working out for him. Then they confront Jean-Claude. How? Where? Renaud stammered. This is an irresponsible accusation. Is it? Joe said accusingly, glaring at Jean-Claude. I suppose it's not irresponsible to let yourself be kidnapped in broad daylight by a person whose face you should have recognized. What? Jean-Claude asked uncomfortably. Frank chuckled. Oh, Joe's just flying off the handle. Imagine, he thinks that maybe you wanted to keep something from us. Imagine, Jean-Claude said with a confused smile. Well, that's all right, Frank. Joe does sometimes get a little hot-headed. Hot-headed, Joe bellowed. It is hot-headed to be annoyed when someone's been lying to you since the first day you met him. Wait a minute, Jean-Claude said, sitting up defiantly. I think all Joe means is, well, it's funny, but it sure seemed as if you'd made some sort of deal with the chestnut vendor. Frank laughed. Just seemed. Jean-Claude swallowed. He tried to laugh, but it came out sounding choked and unconvincing. Oh, by the way, Frank continued in a friendly voice, I almost forgot. Your chestnut vendor friend left a message for you. He said he was going to collect. Joe's steel blue eyes were glinting with rage as he leaned toward Jean-Claude. Yes, and we know exactly what the fee he was collecting was for, don't we? Jean-Claude looked hunted, vulnerable. Now was the time for the finishing touch. Calmly, Nancy asked, We want to know, Jean-Claude, why did you have yourself kidnapped? Faced with that brutal good cop, bad cop, third cop interrogation, Jean-Claude finally admits it. With a sigh, Jean-Claude slumped back in his seat. I never meant to cause so much trouble, he said exhaustedly. It's just that I've been feeling so trapped. He stared listlessly out the window. In my country, everyone knows who I am. They shout at me in the streets. They throw me flowers and marriage proposals scribbled on notebook paper. Whenever anyone says my name, it's with respect and admiration. And when I wake up in the morning, I look out my window to a palace garden. Oh, how awful for you. Being admired and respected and living in a palace, I imagine that would be so difficult. So basically he paid some guy so he could slum it up with the regular upper middle class folk who live in ordinary old houses and whose parents are not kings but lawyers. That's rich person privilege for you. He pays people to kidnap him for a lark while poor old Nancy gets kidnapped all the time without permission. Nancy does some girl math based on a mysterious note she found earlier and figures out the address they're supposed to be going to. What a terrible place, Nancy whispered, her breath coming out in white puffs. She moved closer to Frank, who turned to her with a confident, reassuring look. I'm glad he's here, Nancy thought, and once again she felt a prick of conscience. This was hardly the time to be thinking about Frank. Still, she couldn't help herself. Bess might be dead, but Nancy still has time to get horny over Frank. A fenced-in yard contained all sorts of tractors, forklifts, and backhoes. Jean-Claude stared at the yard full of vehicles. You know, he said, with the snow on them, they look like a forgotten herd of dinosaurs, frozen in time, don't they? The forklift like a Tyrannosaurus, the tractor like a Stegosaurus. Dinosaurs? Joe looked at Jean-Claude with disgust. He couldn't believe his ears. Here they were, trying to save the life of someone who was in danger because of Jean-Claude, and he was talking about dinosaurs. Jean-Claude truly has the soul of a poet, a poor poet living in poverty in a little tiny Paris garret with the rats. That's what he's like inside, you know. Outside, he may look like a rich wealthy, privileged, powerful prince, but inside he's just a poor, poor little man living paycheck to paycheck. Then Joe and Jean-Claude spot Nancy and Frank being held at gunpoint by the kidnappers. Jean-Claude said, "You go to the back of the building and wait. I'll create the diversion." He set his jaw. "I got us all into this, and I'll get us out." Is he going to die? Because it certainly feels like he's about to prove himself to have been ultimately unselfish with one final dramatic gesture. What Jean-Claude actually does is use a forklift to start demolishing the building. Joe uses this distraction to rescue Bess and the others before one of the four men fired his revolver at Jean-Claude. Joe caught a glimpse of Jean-Claude's face. It was covered with blood, and as Bess ran to him, waving her arms, he slumped forward, unconscious. He must have been shot, Joe thought wildly. The big machine suddenly leaped forward, picking up speed. Jean-Claude's foot had collapsed on the accelerator. Joe's eyes widened with horror as he watched the mechanical monster head straight for Bess. Okay, so Jean-Claude is dead, and Bess is about to get pulverized by a forklift. This book has drama. Luckily, Frank pushes Jean-Claude's lifeless body out of the forklift, takes over the controls, and prevents it from hitting Bess. Oh, and also, Jean-Claude is alive, even though there's a strong possibility Frank ran him over with the forklift. Back at the hotel, Bess gets peckish and decides to eat her plot essential chocolate crown as a snack. Bess opened the box and took out the chocolate crown. "The guy told me it was a one-of-a-kind design," Bess said. She lifted the crown and took a big bite. "Yuck," she said, spitting the chocolate out. "That is the weirdest filling. It tastes like plastic." "Hey, let's see." Frank picked up the chocolate and examined it. A yellow, clay-like filling oozed out onto his hand. "It is plastic, all right," he said, his eyes flashing with recognition. "Plastic explosive." Parents, please remember to check your kids' Halloween candy. I just found plastic explosive in this chocolate crown. America's hottest teen sleuths deduced that not all of the kidnappers were hired by Jean-Claude, and that some of them were targeting Bess. And when they ransacked Nancy and Bess's room, they were looking for the chocolate crown, but didn't find it because it was in the Hardys' room. Bess was staring, crestfallen, at the ruined crown. "This is awful. I should never have talked that guy at the chocolate shop into giving me this thing. I should have let him send it away the way he was supposed to." Nancy, Frank, and Joe all looked at her. "Send it away," Frank said. "Yeah, it was some kind of special shipment," the guy said. Bess took a step back. "Don't all look at me like that. They just look so good all sitting there on that metal tray." "They?" Joe said. "How many were there?" "I don't know, 20 maybe?" "Think, Bess, this is important," Nancy said. "Where were they being sent? Did he say?" Nancy was literally there. She was standing right next to Bess while this was happening, while Bess was having this conversation with the guy. Maybe she's just forgotten and is too embarrassed to admit it. The gang drives over to the chocolate shop, but the proprietors stepped out for the moment, so they do the most logical thing in that situation. Wait for them to get back. Just kidding. They break into the building. Joe, in fact, climbs up into a second-story window. With a self-satisfied grin, he thought to himself, "She thinks Jean-Claude is the only guy who can climb buildings, huh? Does he really think Bess is just attracted to Jean-Claude because he climbs all over the place like some sort of monkey?" Oh, Joe. Stepping into the room, he looked around in awe. In the center was an enormous steel vat, attached to about 12 different gauges, and filled with bubbling, molten chocolate. On a far table, there were steel chocolate bar molds, along with temperature recording devices and a computer screen. Joe goes over to the computer, punches some keys, and he's in. This chocolate shop has a stunning lack of cybersecurity. Then a menu pops up on the screen. Accounts payable, accounts receivable, delivery orders, employee records, payroll. Joe's job is literally in law enforcement. Is he not aware of data protection laws and how illegal this is? Or Were there no data protection laws in 1988? He discovers that the chocolate crowns are being sent to the United Nations Gala in honor of Sarkon's birthday that evening. Something a smarter detective than America's sexiest teen sleuths would have been able to discover without needing to go to the chocolate shop. I knew that chocolate thing looked familiar, Joe says, a man who literally saw the crown they were modeled after just 2 days ago. Then some thugs break in and start fighting Joe. He was flying through the air toward a deep, hot, churning mass of molten chocolate. Joe plunged into the vat of thick, gooey liquid. He struggled to his knees and tried to open his eyes, but they were weighted down by the sticky heaviness of the chocolate. Before he could raise his hand to his face, he felt a vice-like grip on his shoulders. "Try some more," the guttural voice said, pushing Joe down. "It's good." Joe disappeared under the chocolate. He struggled desperately against the unseen hand, but it was as if he were in quicksand. His lungs hurt agonizingly. This is it, he thought, the first person in history to drown in a vat of chocolate. Then the grip on his shoulder loosened. Joe propelled himself to the surface. Instinctively, he sucked in a mouthful of air, taking in about a quarter pound of chocolate with it. Coughing violently, he wiped away the chocolate from his eyes and saw Nancy standing over the inert figure of the masked man. Over her head, she held a shiny steel chocolate mold. "Look out," Joe shouted. Behind Nancy, another masked man rushed up, holding a length of clear tubing between his two hands. Nancy spun around and stepped aside. As the man charged past her, she grabbed the tubing and pulled. The man somersaulted across the floor. Joe grabbed the side of the vat and pushed down, trying to boost himself up and over. Suddenly, he felt the vat tipping forward. It wasn't going to support his weight. His hand slipped, and he plunged back inside. Look me in the eyes and tell me this isn't a slapstick comedy. Joe tips over the vat and sends an unstoppable wave of molten chocolate towards the thugs, effectively stopping them. Then the sleuths escape, taking Count Renault's limo to the UN Gala. However, the Count's driver, Francois, takes them in the opposite direction. Then they realize it was Renault all along. Suddenly, Nancy knew exactly what she had to do. She reached into her bag, and she saw all three of her friends' eyes widen as she dug out a familiar, yellow, clay-like substance. "No, Nancy," Bess said. "You wouldn't." Nancy gave Bess a sharp look. In a voice loud enough for Francois to hear, she said, "We have no choice, Bess." With a broad motion, she smeared the stuff on Francois's plexiglass barrier. "Recognize this, Francois?" she said. Francois blanched. "Young lady, do you have any idea what you're playing with?" he asked. "I don't know. Maybe you can give me some advice." Nancy shoved her hand back into her bag, ripped the detonator out of the chocolate bomb, and planted it firmly in the gooey mess on the barrier. "Is this right so far?" The limo screeched to a stop. Francois spun around. "Now see here." "No, you see here," Nancy retorted. She reached into her bag once again, pulled out her portable radio, and took the cover off the battery housing. Then she tore out the wires from her headphones. Holding them up close to the detonator with the batteries in her other hand, she looked straight into Francois's terrified face. "If we're going to go, Francois," she said simply, "you're going with us." With that, she plugged the headphones into the radio and turned it on. Francois hit the lock release. All the locks popped open. They escape and hail a taxi. "Whew, that was close," Nancy said. "Close?" Joe said with disbelief. "I thought you were going to blow us to bits. How could you be so reckless with the plastique?" Nancy smiled. "What plastique?" She looked over to see 3 pairs of dumbfounded eyes. "Oh, the stuff on the plexiglass," she said with a mischievous smile. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small plastic tub. On it were the words, "La bouillie de visage, a European facial regeneration treatment." Bess's face broke out into a broad smile. "The face mud from Bloomingdale's," she crowed. "I told you that stuff would come in handy. Nancy is an evil genius." The gang arrives at the UN gala only to find out that after all that, they aren't allowed in because they don't meet the dress code. Especially you, Candyman. Instead of warning security of a potential bomb threat, the three untrained teenagers decide to disguise themselves as waitstaff and deal with it themselves. You don't get to be the hottest teen sleuths in the biz without putting yourself in some actual heat. Luckily, the door to the staff changing room isn't locked, and there are conveniently piles of uniforms sitting out for them to try on. They don't even get questioned when they enter the gala. This is the United Nations. Why would they need tight security? Once inside, they discover there's a chocolate crown sitting on each table, and the guy holding the detonator is the DJ. He sure is ready to make it lit in here. Everyone's going to have a blast. However, Joe clips the wires before the party really heats up. Then Renault holds Bess at gunpoint and gives his villain monologue. Basically, he planned to explode the gala because he's part of a secret underground movement planning a coup against Jean-Claude's father, the king. Not really sure how killing a bunch of diplomats in an explosion would help him achieve that, but then again, I'm not part of a secret underground movement plotting to kill the king of a vaguely European country. I swear. They managed to overpower Count Renault and the DJ and hand them over to the UN security team, who've finally decided to show up. Nancy's eyes were caught by a couple heading toward the door. She wasn't quite sure what it was about them that was familiar. One of them was a fat man with a gray mustache and wispy gray hair. Next to him was a thin teenage boy with black hair and a rosy, smooth complexion. Where have I seen them? Nancy kept asking herself. She took a few steps toward them and looked more closely enough to see a few strands of hair peeking out from around the younger man's collar. Red hair. Fiona, Nancy blurted, and that's Dr. Fox. The meddling kids chase after them, but the two cat burglars escape in a taxi before Nancy and her friends can catch them. Conveniently, before they got into the taxi, they accidentally dropped the bag containing the Sarcone crown jewels, which they'd been attempting to steal. I don't believe it, Nancy said, shaking her head. What great detectives. We thwarted the cat burglars after all, and we didn't even know it. America's hottest teen sleuths. Hard at work. At the airport, Nancy says goodbye to Frank. Nancy looked up at Frank. What could she say? That it had been fun? That didn't really describe it. That she'd loved working with him? That sounded too official. That he made her feel so wonderful and so confused that she couldn't think straight? None of the above, she decided. Sometimes honesty wasn't the best policy. Bye, Frank, she said, trying to keep the emotion checked. Have a wonderful Christmas. I hope we get the chance to do this again. Me too, Frank said. On the plane, Bess is sad because Jean-Claude has decided to be a responsible member of the Sarcone royal family instead of being her boyfriend. She says, "You know how to do it right, Nancy. You never get involved." Nancy nodded. Bess was right about that. At least this time, anyway. I have to say, I loved this book. It was just pure festive fun and so delightfully, ridiculously camp. A dramatic limo chase through Central Park, explosive chocolate, Jean-Claude climbing buildings being normalized, Nancy being unable to chase a suspect because she gets caught up in a game of Snap the Whip, Nancy using a face mask to replicate plastic explosive, and of course, who could forget Joe falling into a vat of liquid chocolate. Just a silly, goofy time trying to prevent a large party of people from getting exploded to death. And after all, what's more Christmassy than that? Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you for all your support this year. We reached 1K subscribers. I started streaming on YouTube. We introduced channel memberships. And I ate an onion. A good year. Count Renault. Oh my god.